Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Quali. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of the session or you'd like to just share it with a friend, the on-demand will be made available to you after today's webinar concludes. I'll point your attention to the right side of your screen where you'll find a couple tabs, the first one being the chat tab. This is going to be where we want you to engage with one another, engage with us. Feel free to contribute to the conversation any way you see fit here. And if you have any questions, jump over to the Q&A tab and drop them in there. Our speakers today plan to leave as much time as possible to answer any of your questions, so get them in as soon as you can. And finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So stick around to see if you're one of our lucky winners. On to the topic at hand today. It is closing the IaC gaps, securely scale and accelerate DevOps processes. And I'm joined today by Roni Dover, Field CTO at Quali, and Ronak Raman, DevRel Manager at Quali. And it is my pleasure at this time to turn the floor over to them. Thank you guys so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Hey, y'all, let me share my screen. Okay, as Cody mentioned, we're talking today about closing the IaC gaps, securely scale and accelerate DevOps processes. And our speakers, Roni, let you introduce yourself.
Hi, so my name is Roni Dover. I'm Field CTO at Quali. I've been doing automation of environments for quite a while now, and excited to be here and talk about some of the trends we're seeing in Infrastricture-as-code.
And hey, y'all, I'm Ronak Raman. I am the DevRel and Community Manager at Quali. I basically have been a DevOps engineer and a professional services engineer for 10 plus years, and I'm really happy to have this talk with you guys. All right, so let's move on to our agenda. Here's our agenda, so you know what to expect. And we are going to, just give an overview. Then we're going to be talking about, some infrastructure trends here and the challenges, and what we're really here to talk to you about, the challenges with IaC adoption at scale, and then our solution at Quali, a demo, and then we'll wrap it up with the best part, your questions and answering those. All right. So first, Quali overview. All right. As you can see here, we are a software company on a mission to accelerate digital transformation. We make products, simply put, to make creating a cloud environment easy, reusable, secure, and to keep costs under control. We are present in the AWS marketplace, a large number of Fortune 500. We have a large footprint globally and a large number of Fortune 500 customers. And so that's, sort of Quali in a nutshell right here and some of our logos. Okay, let's jump right into it, right? So what we're seeing, and trends right now with infrastructure as code, I'm going to back up for a second and talk about, what the purpose is. You have infrastructure as code, but the real purpose is you're creating a deployment target, and we'll refer to those as environments. And environments are complex, many people are running their application and they're, in their CI/CD pipeline, they're deploying it. A quick example would be, say, a 3-tier application, right? And it might contain a web server, a persistent layer, such as a database, and various different cloud resources, for instance, storage and load balancers and whatnot. So how to keep your environment up to date and to match the needs of your application, which is also changing through a CI/CD pipeline, and what are the best practices when your application is flowing through that CI/CD pipeline, how does your environment keep up? Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ronnie. Please just jump in.
No, I'm getting a bit of an echo. I hope it goes away now. So one of the things that I've been noticing as a developer myself, and that we're also seeing in the field with our customers, is that whereas before we had a situation where infrastructure as code and infrastructure in general was kind of something that was the sole kind of ownership of the IT team or the ops team, it is now becoming a bit different, because as we're thinking about our application and microservices and components as individual pieces that need to be deployed and released, each of them has its own kind of infrastructure as code aspects to it. And this is a greater revolution than it seems, because what it in fact means is that it's an integral part of something that's very dev oriented, to have something kind of a part of it that is very IT oriented. And as we'll see, this is causing a lot of friction, but it is also kind of representing an opportunity to create something a bit more agile and a bit more kind of modern around the practices of infrastructure as code. And we'll get to that in a second. But I think the takeaway first is that whereas before we had this huge infrastructure as code for staging environment, for example, that included all of the different services there, and that was the main artifact that was being deployed and released. What we're seeing today is that it's kind of breaking up into micro infrastructure as code services, basically each of them matching its own target component. And the challenge is, how do you create now in a reliable way something that's a composite of all of those little mini infrastructure as code assets? And I think we'll talk about that more later on. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So I heard Ronnie talk about, speed, democratization of the needs of infrastructure, moving away from an IT to to more of a development. And if that sounds familiar to you, you're right. This requires a paradigm shift with infrastructure. Automating is great for speeding things up, but we must also not forget, when you speed things up and you speed up application development, organizations are quickly finding out that deployment targets or environments are the next level of bottlenecks. How to deploy your CI/CD produced binaries. And the way we are thinking of it is, you have to include your environments in the pipeline, in the CI/CD pipeline. And you must think of these that have a life cycle of provisioning, operating, updating, and decommissioning as well. And, that's what we're showing here. Ronnie, did you want to say anything more about how we're thinking about our environments within the pipeline?
Sure. So I think that looking at the environment, the IaC assets as a part of your code base, present some challenges, because just like you would want to test your code prior to launching in production, you want to test your infrastructure as code assets as well as a part of that code. And that means that environments that are created during testing must align more and more to real life full-scale production environments. Because if the goal is to have reliable, immutable assets that you can always launch, kind of remove the fear of any production issues, because you can always start another one. It needs to be well tested as a part of the pipeline. And that also kind of shift left the infrastructure as code assets from being something that is the concern of the team that's doing the deployment of the application, to something that is more integrally bound to the application lifecycle and the CI/CD pipeline itself. Again, something that needs to be considered, especially if we look at how to scale these pipelines and to make sure that it doesn't slow down development processes, that we can troubleshoot and understand issues when they arise, not just in the code, but also in the infrastructure as code aspects. And we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah. So as Ronnie mentioned, we are seeing basic infrastructure as code and platform as service tools are being used as an attempt to alleviate this bottleneck of environment creation. But as Ronnie just mentioned, that's not sufficient. We have to think of our infrastructure assets and indeed how we create them, because they're being created by source code, as a part of your application development cycle. We may create our infrastructure through Terraform, for example, or but then we might want to, in the next layer, deploy our application through Ansible, or another example, I might set up a Kubernetes cluster but want to deploy my binaries through Helm. The idea here is, and if you see the top of this triangle here, you need a sort of orchestration to get all of these parts to work together in creating this environment to deploy your application to. And Ronnie, do you have more on that you want to say on the full stack environment?
So first of all, what you said is exactly spot on. And what we are seeing is that from being very separate, infrastructure as code and a kind of a different layer for config management or application deployment and a different layer for the orchestration of the whole environment, it's becoming, or the borders are becoming a little bit more shady. And what we're seeing is that it becomes an integrated environment that we want to produce. It's not that one team is providing the infrastructure, going to the other team saying, go deploy your application. It's becoming one process, one full stack from infrastructure as code technologies, let's say Terraform or CloudFormation or CDK, to the application deployment itself on top of it. So if it is Helm for Kubernetes, if it is, as you mentioned, Ansible, if it is other kind of scripts that need to run in order to configure my application, and if it is the orchestration that is definitely kind of the glue holding it all together, what brings in the data or the database and imports it in, how to integrate with all of the rest of the tools in the ecosystem that I'm using for observability and monitoring and other concerns. So looking at it as one complex piece, we can understand several things. First of all, it's very heterogeneous in kind of the technology landscape of it. So there is a lot of different technologies that are required, that you're required to master in order to get this fully working. And as is the case with complexity, there are more moving parts. There is more friction and more kind of potential to hit some snags because these things need to be well coordinated. The other aspect of it is that the existing tooling were kind of very geared towards treating each one of these layers as a problem of its own. So that you have maybe tools that will let you automate your Terraform, and you have tools that will let you automate your Helm, and you may have even tools that are workflow orchestrators, but these are not separate problems. So what we're seeing is that ultimately, if you have to use multiple tools and keep them in sync, we're taking something that is a complex problem as it is and making it even more complex. And in these kinds of things, especially if you scale, right? So if the challenge that you see in this slide is kind of a challenge that you're facing and you're kind of one team, one kind of pizza team that's taking on this challenge, you probably got this. Even if it will take you a bit more time, that friction will translate to, let's say, a few hours more each week. If you want to deploy this at scale in the organization, one of the laws of complexity is that it scales exponentially. Every little friction will become kind of compounded and something that will definitely become a bottleneck and a source of issues. each one of these issues will delay a team or will delay releases. That delay, again, will become more and more felt the larger the team is. And eventually, this is what we're seeing as another kind of cause of friction. Now, the other aspect of it, and let me maybe, if you can transition to the next slide, just to complete my thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is around expertise. So as I mentioned before, we have here multiple different types of technologies that are being employed. And people need to have kind of not just a working knowledge, but an expert knowledge of these technologies in order to successfully create such a holistic environment that's full stack and can deploy this production-like experience to, or production-like scale to for testing or for development. Now, we have a lot of people who need such environments, as you can see in this kind of funnel or pyramid. There are some technical people with kind of skills in each one of these areas, but not so much people who are kind of the experts. To give an example, let's say I want to run an environment in AWS or in Azure, and I need to make it large scale with all of the things that are going to actually run in production. From load balancers, WAF, networking settings, seeders, also all sorts of things that I don't want to test for the first time in production. So the people in the organization who can not just kind of create such an environment or modify the production IaC to make this scale down or parameterized version of it that is suitable, they're not anybody who just happens to know AWS. They need to be experts, because ultimately, if there is an issue there, then it's a compliance issue for the entire organization. It's a security issue for the entire organization. We have repeatedly seen it becoming cost issue for the entire organization, because these environments, if they're not well designed or well architected, they will eventually be a liability. And the same goes for the orchestration and the configuration, right? You want an expert to be able to do that in order to have a reliable pipeline that won't fail each time. So ultimately, what we're seeing is that it's not enough to have somebody who, let's say, knows a bit of Terraform in order to get this environment running. Suddenly, you rely on the people who are experts in cloud, because only they, like Terraform is great, and we're going to show in a second how you can ingest it in our own product, but it doesn't solve any expertise problem, because ultimately to write Terraform that's well architected, you need to know architecture and cloud very well. And only in that way you can produce reliable infrastructure-as-code. In the same way that to create repeatable automation for your configuration, you need to be to have experts with the right technologies. If it is Helm, if it is scripting, or if it is Ansible, it doesn't really matter. But whatever it is, you need to know it quite well. Now, what we're seeing, and I think you alluded before to kind of the hiring issue that many organizations are facing today. It's very hard to find these superhuman beings who are great at everything, right? To find somebody who is an expert Terraform kind of, he's a Terraform whiz. He also knows AWS like the back of his hand. The company also happens to be using GCP, and he's a master of that as well. He knows it's kind of like the very model of a modern major developer, right? It's somebody who needs to be a jack of all trades and expert in everything.
And Ronnie, she also happens to just be on your application development team for some reason.
And she's clonable, right? You managed to get this one person who managed to tick all of those boxes, and then you need to clone. Otherwise, like you won't be able to meet the needs of a growing kind of crowd of people who need environments, who we see kind of at top of the funnel there. So ultimately, this is creating a lot of scale issues in terms of skill gaps in the organization. And one of the challenges there is, how do we do more with less? How do we take what the experts do and make it inherently reusable and accessible in a very modular way for people that want to add functionality on top of it? We won't solve the silo problem, but we can make sure that each silo of knowledge can contribute their knowledge in such a way that it's kind of becoming an asset for the rest of the organization, rather than becoming kind of an endpoint that everybody now needs to work with and slows down the process. Hope
Before
that makes sense.
Yeah, that, and I just wanted to add before we move on to the next slide, and I'm hoping Ronnie will be able to, also, this was his experience. Every single person when we were at reInvent that we talked to, that came by our booth, or that we even bumped into randomly, I think every single person in multiple different rows, all the way from managers all the way down to IT personnel and application developers, discuss that they have the same pain. Probably many of you watching are very familiar with this. So, okay, I'll get to the next slide where we can go just a little step down into what that IaC pipeline looks like. And I before I turn it over again to Ronnie to talk about the very complex portions of this, I'll just remind folks that high level, we've already alluded to this when we talked about putting your environment in the pipeline. And remember, we want to, it's not just many of you probably have already run into this problem. Your environments will go stale. Your test environment needs to be refreshed, if you will. So there is a life cycle of provisioning, accessing, operating, updating, and then finally decommissioning to save costs for your environment. Ronnie, would you like to elaborate on the pipeline and these complex tasks? Did I lose Ronnie?
I apologize. Give me 1 second. Speaking of infrastructure, we have construction work here. So this is infrastructure, not as code. So if you will allow me 2 minutes, I'll relocate.
No, I will. I'll absolutely. I'll go ahead and speak to it. Ronnie knows this much better, but while we were dealing with an infrastructure not as code issue, I'd be happy to talk about some of this. I'm sure many folks who are watching this are very familiar with this, but the ad here is, if you're thinking about the paradigm shift of, and it's not a big leap, right, to think of your environment also changing with DevOps best practices, which are, small changes often. If you think of your environment that way, it's not too hard to envision these different phases. In what I call provisioning, if you think about it as the create and import, you've got the it's not just as simple as, oh, I'm just going to run a script and I'm going to, push out some infrastructure. You have to, discover and import the IaC assets. How do you integrate that and define the usage rules, the RBAC and whatnot? I see we have, Ronnie, are you good? Are you back in?
Yeah.
Okay, you know this way better than me. Why don't you go ahead and take over?
No worries, and apologies for the interruption. So I think, and this is really related to the pipeline question, but this time more from a process perspective. Using infrastructure as code is easy. Using it at scales require more control. And what do I mean by that? It's not just a matter of taking some scripts, giving everybody the scripts, the Terraform modules, and telling them, go run them.
Wow.
Because ultimately, we want to make sure of two things. First of all, that people have the right permissions And sometimes they need to launch or use a platform that they don't even have permissions to run directly. So you want to, first of all, import in your infrastructure as code assets, the Terraforms, the cloud formations, whatever it is you're using for infrastructure as code. And you want to integrate it in such a way with the cloud and peripheral services so that you can provide something that's an integrated experience. For example, secret management. For example, roles to be able to access the cloud. All of those should be kind of, or the infrastructure as code should be able to kind of access all of these assets very natively. The next part is how do we distribute it to the team? So it's, again, the worst anti-pattern I've seen is kind of sending people scripts, over email, or even if it's a link to source control, because ultimately we want to not take these infrastructure as code assets raw. We want to reuse them in different teams under different configurations. So we want to package them, and we want to make it very easy to package them with different settings and allowed parameters. So if there's an input, we want to kind of define the restrictions for each team or for each project. We want role-based access controls around who gets access to which asset, for how long, how many of it can they spin up at the same time. These kinds of basic policies that on the one hand will allow the experts that we were talking about before to feel comfortable that what they're kind of sending to the rest of the organization will be used in the proper way, and will kind of, they can guarantee the practices that they had in mind. Then consumption itself needs to be very easy, self-service for everybody, if within the code or if kind of outside the code. If I want an RDS for just for testing, or if I want to create a fully working environment that has all of these aspects integrated into it and works with my other infrastructure as code assets, so, or with my configuration and application deployment assets, right? So a complete experience where I can have the RDS database, but I can also have my Kubernetes application, and I can consume them as one kind of easy blueprint or a environment plan. Finally, as this is going on, as you mentioned before, Rona, kind of democratizing cloud access by giving everybody kind of this self-service way to consume these assets, we want to make sure that the experts, the ops, the cloud operators have the right governance, so that we're tagging, we're tracking the usage, we're tracking life cycle management, we're automating teardown as well as setup, and that we have a process that allows us to not roll it, to roll it out at scale. And in the same way that when I roll out my website, I want to use Google Analytics to understand who's using it and how is it working, and whether it's being used in the correct way. We want to be able to have the same kind of control as we roll out our infrastructure as code assets. So in a sense, we want to provide the way to for the silos experts to roll out their assets and package it correctly, and also parameterize it correctly for different use cases, and also include role-based asset control into it. We want to make it very easy for people to use it in their own or with their own technologies that they're using. So a developer could use it along with dev-centric technologies to also create this holistic end-to-end environment. And we want to ensure governance. We want to make sure that the person who's accountable for security, compliance, cost, whatever it is, has a very, very easy way to track what's going on. And even within other tools, still not lose track of what's going on. Not to have it democratized doesn't mean completely distributed and lawless. It actually means doing it in a way that's accessible to everybody, but still has an order to it, right? We want to believe that democracy still has an order to it, and rules and laws. They're just open and they don't slow us down, which is what we want to accomplish here. So with that, I think
part.
I think it's enough talking, especially on my end, and a great opportunity to kind of show how all of these concepts kind of mesh together in the work that we're doing with some of our customers, and we saw some of these names flash before, and how our platform is trying to tackle these ideas as an example of how you would solve these problems with a infrastructure automation kind of holistic offering. So with that, let me share my screen, and I'll take you through it.
This is where the rubber meets the road, y'all.
Exactly. So Rona, give me an indication if my screen rendered out correctly.
I will. Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I've just logged into Torque. Torque is our kind of infrastructure automation platform. And before I kind of dive into specific features and workflows, what I want to start is really with the context. So Torque is a SaaS product. I've just logged into my account. And it's also kind of has multiple subtenants. So each of the teams or projects or whatever level of granularity that I want to use, or the organizations within my company, has its own place here, their own space, as we call it. Each of these spaces has their own assets, their own kind of environments, definitions, their own tracked live environments, and so on. So this is really my workspace here as a developer or a DevOps engineer. Now, the first thing I would want to do, of course, using such a workspace, is integrate it with my local tools and the ecosystem tools that I'm already using. So the first thing in setting up this space, and this space is called Project Pivot. It is used by a team that's developing a promotions management application. And if I go over here to the space settings, you can see that I've actually hooked it up with some of the infrastructure that I have. So the cloud owners have already granted me access to an AWS Dev account and an Azure account. This is kind of a very click next to continue experience where you can actually onboard the clouds. I, as an end user, don't have permissions to do that, but somebody already provided me with that access in this space, as well as to different AWS services. So as you can see, I have an EKS cluster, an AKS cluster, and additional services. I've also onboarded my source control repositories. So this is where I'll be storing my Infrastricture-as-code assets, as well as any artifact repos. In this case, I'm just using an S3 bucket, but this could be Artifactory or any other tools that make sense. Users, I must say, our customers typically use single sign-on or SAML, but I can also see which users are kind of a part of this space. And finally, I would want to kind of integrate it with the rest of my ecosystem. So this is where, again, talking about connecting the dots between Infrastricture-as-code and dev and orchestration, this is where I would kind of connect this workspace with GitHub Actions, with my CI platform of choice. This is where I would use a plugin on my IDE to develop Infrastricture-as-code with these environments in mind, and so on. So with that in place, I can actually start my work right now as an end user. Now,
Ronnie, can I say a quick thing about what you've just shown our users? So I love this product. I actually have used it, in my personal life. But anyways, what Ronnie is about to show you now is the actual use and the creating of environments. But what he has shown you thus far is sort of a one-time setup. It's not a very complicated to use. So these tasks of connecting your source control and integrating it into your, CI/CD platform such as Jenkins or whatever. It's the setting it up within your pipeline. You would not. It's conceivable you would never see it again, or maybe a DevOps team would set it up, and you would just start from here launching your environment. So that's all I wanted to say.
That's a great point. And sometimes in providing the context, need to also give the context that this is not something, or this does not represent everyday use, but it just gives us a context about how this fits in with the rest of my tools. So as an end user, let's say I'm a developer and I want to have access to an environment. And excuse me for starting from the end, as we say. So I'm going to actually show you what usage looks like, and then I'll kind of peel back the layers of the onion to show you how I got there. But as an end user, a developer, a tester, a DevOps engineer, working in this team, I want to create an environment based off my promotions management application. So you can see I have a catalog of different environment blueprints for load testing, for pre-prod, for quality assurance. Each of these is a bit different in terms of the infrastructure that it uses and how much of production it actually brings in. And this is really aligned with what we were talking about before, where environments need to be more integrated as we want to test more and more as a part of our development cycle. Now, you can see here some of my Terraform assets are already kind of available as simple blueprints that I can use. So, for example, if I just need an RDS for testing, or if I need an S3 bucket, or if I need any other assets that I want to use as is, as not just as a part of a complete application environment, that's very easy to do as well. So let's take as an example one of our, let's say, RDS environments. I'm going to spin up such an environment. In order to do that, all I need to do is provide a name for this environment. Let's call it my RDS. I can provide a duration. So for example, I might want to make sure that after 1 day or 2 days, or when I don't need it anymore, it will completely tear down. And I can ensure that everything is cleaned up. Any parameters that were kind of set to me by the blueprint designer. And then when I'm done, I just click start to get this.
And a quick note here also, Ronnie. This is akin to, for those on the call, to you going directly, for example, to your build tool or like your Jenkins and hitting build now. But typically you wouldn't even have to do this. It would be a line in your build script. The environment creation would happen before you go for deployment. So you don't even have to come into the web UI to create that environment and fill out those parameters. You could pass it in a command line as well.
Running, it's actually kind of going through steps. This was a Terraform kind of, and as you can see, we have full access to all of the logs as it's actually doing that, so we can completely understand what's going on, debug and troubleshoot if we need to. One thing to mention is that as a part of this governance to ensure tracking, we've made it possible to define what tasks we want to automatically
that'll help answer the finally, definitively, without magic work going to your, for instance, AWS console. You could answer how much is the project, the application spending on environment costs, which I thought was great, in addition to many other pieces of information.
So let's application instance. So here you can see this is a promotions management application for load testing. This is the application I'm working on. So I have an easy link where I can see kind of the instance that was created on this application. We can see the different applications that were stood up, and we can see multiple microservices there, and the infrastructure that's actually hosting these applications, which can be a Kubernetes, or it can be instances, or it can be serverless, or it can be other things that you want to deploy to. We can also use kind of a built-in bastion to SSH or RDP into any instance or container in the environment, just in case we want to kind of understand exactly what's going on, what went on with the, or get the logs from the deployment, or change anything in the application. That's very easy to do as well. So the bastion is off by default just because we want to save on cost. But in a second, we'll be able to kind of access it and access each individual VM in my environment and kind of understand what the logs look like. While that is starting, I want to show you that in the same way, once our RDS is up and running, we have kind of a full visibility into everything that went there, including the inputs and the outputs, which in this case is the RDS endpoint that I'll be able to use in order to do my work. Now, this is all nice in terms of the user experience, and it's very self-service. I should mention that many of our customers don't use this UI at all, fancy as it is. They prefer to use their IDEs, using the CLI that we provide, using our REST APIs that you can see here kind of as a first-class citizen in the application. To integrate with it, again, it really depends on the type of developers and which tools they're more comfortable with. So having shown that, and of course, as the space owner, I can track which activities are happening, who's starting up environments. You can see there are multiple environments right now in place, which are triggered by automation and so on. Let's peel back, as we said, another layer of the onion and talk about blueprints. So at the core of what we're seeing here, being able to democratize and provide self-service access with role-based access control, is the concept that we can take modular infrastructure-as-code pieces and create blueprints out of them. Okay, so we can start with the individual kind of building block for infrastructure-as-code. So let's say we want to create a building block that users can use based on an infrastructure-as-code asset. First of all, our platform will discover those infrastructure-as-code assets from your repositories. And then we can actually define what are the rules and how do we want to allow to use them. So we can do that from a global perspective, allocating rules for each space or each team. Or in this case, even in this team, I can select kind of, let's say I want to create a flavor of RDS. I can select, let's call it RDS for team. And we can take this and actually set some rules around, let's say, which cloud service do we want to use to deploy it, which region. We can select the different inputs that will be available and what is overridable by the user and what isn't. We can provide lookup values and so on, so that at the end, we create, as well as kind of define the IAM role that will be used to run this. So at the end of the day, we have this very scalable thing where the expert could set rules, contribute this building block, and then provide either the ability to create environments as a standalone from it, or actually integrate it into a more involved full application environment, including the dev resources. So let's take a look at that. So let's take the same RDS and look at what it looks like if I wanted to include it in a dev environment. So again, I'll start with the UI view, where we see kind of, we have a Java Spring application. It has a specific scripts to initialize it, in this case, a specific image it's using, a specific port. And then behind the scenes, we also want to include the RDS module that we saw before. This is actually managed behind the scenes in YAML. And one of the things that is very important to understand about our platform is that it is completely kind of GitOps friendly. Again, talking about the notion of infrastructure as code as a pipeline, all of these assets are actually single sourced in my source control repository, which you saw before, how we integrate with. So it's nice to see this as a fancy UI, but behind the scenes, this is just YAML files. And what you can see in this YAML file, for example, is this Java Spring website component. In this case, I'm using the native capabilities that we have to deploy containers or AMIs, but I could use Terraform or CloudFormation or anything else. And here you can see kind of the platform service I have access to, which is the RDS MySQL server that I'm going to be using. So both of them can be included. This is a very simple, just YAML composition of different assets that I have using different technologies. And these could be dev technologies, ops technologies, but from a user perspective, it's very easy to assemble them. Again, I don't need to have the permissions to run this on my own. I don't need to have permissions for RDS at all, but it can include these assets that were published for me in order to create this more complex and holistic blueprint that includes everything from application configuration to infrastructure as code and so on. The last aspect I want to talk about, and I do want to be conscious of time and leave enough time for questions, is cost. So basically, we're tracking this as multiple ways. We can see who's doing what. We can set policies on what they can do. And we haven't really scratched the surface of what we can do there. But at the same time, we also want to understand what the cost is. And we can understand it on the space level, but we can also look more globally as an administrator and kind of understand the cost that different teams are seeing. And what we've tried to do there is to provide a way into cost that does not actually, that is not infrastructure oriented. So it's not like, oh, cost went up, let me check why. I have 60 new VMs. That doesn't answer any questions, but more from an application-centric, blueprint-centric, activity-centric perspective, be able to understand, let's say for each team, how much is each type of an activity costing me? How much am I spending on load testing? How much am I spending on kind of different integration testings and so on? And this is something that we're still seeing a lot of interest in and are adding more and more features to. Again, trying to differentiate ourselves in being multi-cloud and multi-cloud account, and also in, again, trying to find the angle into it that doesn't look at the infrastructure, but rather the business activity and priority. So with that, although I could probably continue talking for quite some time more, let's pause for a second and return to our slides to make sure that we can answer any questions.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go through the remaining slides fast so that we can leave at least 10 minutes for question and answer. And while I'm sharing my screen, I do want to say that cost panel is awesome. I don't know how many of the folks on this webinar have had to do this, but I worked at a small startup where at the end of the quarter, I would have to sit with the CFO and identify it, and then I'd have to remember and map out all this. It was terrible. Okay, so sharing. Okay, so that was the demo, and I'll try and move through these a bit faster here. So what Roni has shown us, basically we need an end-to-end solution that takes all of these components, to create your environment, which is really in service to getting your application out, right? So, he mentioned RBAC, role-based permissioning and governance, cost controls. You need one end-to-end solution. Roni, did you want to say anything else about this slide?
No, let's quickly go through it. Basically, it just means that we're kind of a middleware between your infrastructure and the end users.
Yeah, and please, if you want to find out more, because we saw Roni do a demo, but the best way to learn about it and how it can make it easier. Since it's middleware, it is a bit abstract and meta. So we have a free tier available. You can hook your own cloud account to it, your own source control, create blueprints. I have done it myself. If you do a search for it, my 14-year-old son suggested I create a Minecraft server that we can turn on and off, up and down, so to save costs. And we kept a persistence layer, so we still have the same world that we built. Please also for our AWS.
I want that to be the next corporate demo, please.
Yeah. No. Yes. We'll. I should have done that. You can find us on AWS Marketplace, and also we have an AWS workshop. If you go to that marketplace, that walks you through it. So if you need a little bit more guidance, okay. So that's all I had to say. We've entered the question and answer portion, and I see that we do have a question here. We have a couple. James is first here. If the component, example tools, storage, compute, etc., are under different teams, what are the coordination controls expectation by each team in the IaC chain?
Okay, let me try to answer that. And I think control is a great it's a great term, because we do see kind of the need to have this control plane for IaC. And the way that we're looking at everything is via self-service. And self-service has two aspects to it. Self-service, by the way, doesn't need to be this Servicenow model of having catalogs and UI and clicks. It just means that you're taking services that you want people to consume, and that you have the tools in order to define how you want them to be consumed. And then instead of providing raw access, you're giving access to these as a service. And this is exactly what each team is doing. So for example, we have a customer that has pretty complex storage setup for some of what they're doing. So they have a storage team that knows all about the storage technology that they're using, because storage is big in their application. But what they've done is basically they've modeled how they want to provision the specific storage infrastructure, if it is, I don't know, NetApp on tap or whatever it is that they're using, and bundled it in a way that makes sense in terms of their architecture, and then also set the right things that are levers and buttons that the user can or cannot change in that, and then made it kind of democratized. So made it possible for anybody to spin up, assuming that this is kept and given these specific requirements. And what that has done is really accelerated their process, because suddenly now everybody is able to access it instead of having to submit a ticket to that team. So again, making it making sure that the rules are enforced, that the experts are in the picture, not making it kind of anybody can now, create, anybody now has access to everything, but making sure that we not slow anybody down, but still have the kind of the right rails around the experience to make sure that it's not creating any issues for the company.
Awesome, and I put the answer while you were talking, Roni, in here. So feel free to well, actually, we'll just have you answer the question. So next question. This is from Steve. Does it require any marketing apps or plugins in AWS or Azure to make this work?
So absolutely not. We don't require any such plugins. We integrate into your cloud account. It's basically a simple process of running CloudFormation if you're using AWS, or running an ARM template if you're using Azure. All of that process is kind of automated through our tool. So you basically click, it redirects you. You can kind of give approval. And what it just provides is permissions for our tool to deploy to your cloud account on your behalf. Kind of like you would do with Spot or with some other tool that kind of automates cloud environments.
Yep, excellent. All right. And then our next question, the way I answered it, I was like, absolutely not. You don't need anything else. You just hook bring your own cloud and your own source control repo where you'll be creating your blueprints in JSON and you're good to go. All right. This question is from James. Does integration include Servicenow change management?
So definitely, today, some of our customers integrate with ServiceNow using one of the things that we made sure, or that was very important for us, and this was true when I was a part of the dev team as well. It was very important for us to be easily consumed and to integrate with your services. And we know ServiceNow is being used a lot and provides a lot of value for some customers. And that's why we've made it very easy to integrate with either from ServiceNow or from other sources. That said, we are actually beefing up our ServiceNow integration in the following months. And this includes, both change management, approval workflows, CMDBs for some assets, and so on. So we should be expecting more and more integrated feature in the platform around that, in addition to our current kind of integration that's possible through our integration points.
All right. And I believe that's all the asked questions here. We have about 4 minutes. I do have some additional questions that, sort of I prepped or we prepped ahead of time. Unless there are any more questions that anybody would like to throw in there real quick. While that's happening, I'll just go ahead and say, all right. So how do you measure the effectiveness of your solution, and what type of results can you expect, Ronnie?
Yeah, that's actually not a made-up question. It's one that we were asked repeatedly in previous sessions. So I think it's a good one to point out. And the result that we're seeing in terms of the impact to our customers is around 3 areas. It's around velocity, and this is a big, big thing. So how fast can teams move? How slowed down or bogged down are they by environment issues? The other one is stability of the pipeline. So basically, we've had, because of these expertise gaps, because of these kind of, it's possible to kind of string everything together, but it's not reusable. It's not really a platform. We have some customers that are struggling with builds being read for no reason, just because there's some environment issue, and then somebody needs to fix it, and then it's not the right person, or he doesn't understand the technology, and this slows things down again, but it also creates quality issues. So improving the stability of your pipeline. And then the last aspect is cost. So being able to run everything on demand, as we saw before, to have automated teardown, to set rules around consumption as well, is on the one hand drastically lowering cost, but also increasing the effectiveness and the efficiency, because you're able to do more DevOps with less work. And with that, I think we also wanted to give some time for Cody here on the session to say goodbye. So in any case, from our side, we can wrap up by saying, if you want additional information, Torque.io is the place to go, and the links are going to be here in the session.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Do you have any final closing remarks before we officially close our program out today?
So yeah, it was great to do this demo. I'm always passionate, and it's always a pleasure to be talking about these topics, because they're so near and dear and kind of relevant to people that I talk to. And if you're interested in hearing more, we very much be happy to speak with you and give you some more of what we're seeing and some of our insights. And Ronak, do you want to say something on your end?
I just want to say, Cody, thank you for hosting us. To all attending, thank you so much for spending some time with us. These were great questions. For the folks on the chat, thank you for being involved. I left our website a link in there, and we hope to see and talk with you soon.
Outstanding. Just a quick reminder that today's session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand. You'll also find it living on the DevOps website if you just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. Now, the moment where we announced our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Bryson O. Our second winner is Jamie S. Our third winner is Julia R. And our fourth and final winner is Radu R. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't find an email, just check your spam folder. Ronak and Roni, again, thank you so much for taking the time to put together this program, this demo, and sharing your expertise with us. I'd also like to thank Quali for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience, for being with us today for today's presentation. Have a great rest of your day, and please fill out our post-webinar survey.
Thank you.